Have you ever held a secret so heavy it felt like it had its own heartbeat, a dull, steady drum against your ribs, reminding you it was there with every breath you took? I have. For more than 60 years, I carried a secret that shaped every corner of my life, a weight that I honestly believed would follow me all the way to my grave. My name is Eleanor N. Schmidt, though most folks who know me these days just call me Ellie. I am 83 years old now, and when I look at my hands, I do not just see the wrinkles and the liver spots of age. I see a map of a long, hard road, a road that started in a place that was supposed to be a haven but was, instead, a hell of our own quiet making. I am telling you this now, not because I want your pity, and Lord knows I am not looking for praise, but because I have lived long enough to learn that even the deepest, most jagged wounds can eventually let in the light. Sometimes, the only way to help someone else find their way out of the darkness is to be brave enough to show them the treacherous path you took yourself. My story begins in a small, sleepy town in the heart of Alabama, a place called Millbrook, where the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms in the summer could not quite cover the bitter smell of secrets. It was a town where everyone knew your name, but no one, absolutely no one, really knew your truth. Our house sat on Elm Street, a pretty, white-painted two-story with dark blue shutters and a wide front porch. There was a swing there where my mother, Mary, would sometimes sit on her good days, rocking slowly back and forth, her eyes fixed on something far away that none of the rest of us could see. To everyone in Millbrook, we were the Johnsons, a good, solid family. My father, Walter Johnson, was the proprietor of Johnson's General Store, which was much more than a shop. It was the hub of the entire town. It was where you heard the gossip, celebrated a good harvest, or lamented a bad one. My father was seen as a pillar of the community, a man who would generously offer credit when a family fell on hard times, and who always had a piece of hard candy from the jar on the counter for the children who came into the store. He had a broad, confident smile for the congregation at the First Baptist Church on Sundays and a firm, reassuring handshake for the men he did business with. He was respected, trusted, even admired. When I think back on it, I have to wonder if the whole town was complicit in a way, so eager to believe in the idea of a good man that they refused to see the signs. But the man the town saw was a carefully constructed fiction. He was not the man who lived behind our front door. The real Walter Johnson, the one I knew, waited until the locks were turned for the night and the curtains were drawn tight. The real Walter Johnson was a monster dressed in a good man's clothes. I was 12 years old when the monster first showed himself to me, and my life was cleaved in two, the time before and the endless, terrifying time after. It was a humid summer evening in 1953. The kind where the air is so thick and what you can taste the rain that stubbornly refuses to fall. The cicadas were buzzing their frantic, deafening song in the trees outside. I was in my room, sitting in the little nook by the window, lost in a book about faraway adventures. He came in without knocking. He never knocked. The entire house was his domain. He smelled of whiskey and Old Spice, a combination that, for the rest of my life, would make my stomach clench with fear. He sat on the edge of my bed, the mattress, sighing under his weight. He told me I was becoming a woman now, that I was his special girl, and that there were things a father had to teach his daughter to prepare her for the world. His voice was low and smooth, like honey laced with poison. And there, in the dim, gentle light of my bedside lamp, with the sound of crickets chirping their ordinary song just outside my window, my childhood was brutally and irrevocably ended. The pain was sharp and shocking, a tearing violation that my young mind could not process. But worse than the pain, so much worse, was the shame. It was a thick, oily thing that coated my insides, that filled my mouth and silenced the scream that was clawing its way up my throat. Afterward, he simply stood up, straightened his belt, and smoothed his hair in the reflection of the window. "This will be our special secret, Eleanor," he said, his voice casual, as if he had just taught me how to tie my shoes. A secret just between a father and his favorite girl. My mother, Mary, was a fragile creature, As delicate and breakable as the porcelain shepherdess dolls she kept lined up on the mantelpiece. The town doctor, a man who was also my father's fishing buddy, said she had a nervous condition, a vague, dismissive term for the deep and abiding sadness that clung to her like a second skin. Her days were measured out in doses of laudanum from a small, dark brown bottle, the medicine that was supposed to soothe her nerves but instead plunged her into a listless fog. She would drift through the house like a ghost, her eyes distant and clouded, her hands often trembling. But I had to try. I had to believe she could save me. I waited for one of her rare good days, a morning when the fog seemed to have lifted just a little, and her eyes held a spark of her former self. I found her in the kitchen, her hands unsteady as she arranged flowers in a vase. I started to speak, my own voice a foreign, choked thing. "Mom?" I whispered. "Papa, he..." The words got stuck, caught on the barbs of my fear and shame. I tried again.
"He's doing things to me, Mama."
"Bad things." For a single, fleeting second, a look of pure, unadulterated terror flashed across her face. It was the look of someone seeing a monster in a dark room. But then, it was gone, shuddered away as quickly as it had appeared.
She did not look at me.
She stared intently at the flowers, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the glass vase. "Hush now, Eleanor," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of dead leaves. "You must not tell such wicked lies. Your father is a good man, a respected man. He provides for us." That night, the sound of my father's raised voice carried from their bedroom, followed by the sickening, unmistakable thud of a fist meeting flesh. The next morning, Mama wore a thick layer of powder to cover the new, dark bruise blooming on her cheek, and she refused to meet my eyes for a week. I learned then, in the most brutal way possible, that my mother was not a sanctuary. She was just another prisoner in the same jail, and her weakness, her absolute dependence on him, was the lock on her own cage. She had made her choice long ago. Willful ignorance was her only strategy for survival. The walls of our house on Elm Street were not built to keep danger out. They were built to keep his secrets in. After my mother's refusal, a new kind of quiet fell over the house. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a forest where a predator is known to be hunting. My life became a series of calculated movements, a tightrope walk over a pit of fire. The abuse did not stop. It simply became a grotesque feature of my landscape, like a twisted, dead tree in the backyard that you learn to walk around. It was a ritual of power and fear, enacted in the quiet moments of our lives, those pockets of time when the world was not looking. He was clever, my father. It was never when my mother was fully lucid, always in the twilight hours when she was lost in her medicated haze, or when he had manufactured some errand to send her on. The fear was a constant companion, a low hum beneath the surface of everything. I learned to read the weather of his moods with the precision of a seasoned sailor. I knew the subtle shift in his eyes that signaled a coming storm, the way he would tap his fingers impatiently on the counter when he was growing restless, the false, booming joviality that often preceded his most monstrous acts. I felt like a ghost in my own home, my own body. The girl I had been, the one who loved the smell of old books and dreamed of seeing the ocean, was gone. She had been hollowed out, and in her place was this silent, watchful creature whose only purpose was to anticipate, to endure, and to survive. My body was no longer my own. It was a territory he had claimed, and I simply retreated to a small, fortified corner of my mind, watching the violation from a great and terrible distance. My only solace in that suffocating world was my sister, Betty. She was 5 years younger than me, a bright, bubbly thing with hair the color of corn silk, usually tied up in ribbons that bounced when she ran. Her laugh was the purest sound I knew, like a handful of little bells being shaken. She still believed in magic and fairy tales, and her innocence was a balm to my wounded soul. She was the one good, clean thing in a life that felt irrevocably soiled. I would read to her at night, our heads close together under a patchwork quilt, and for a little while, I could escape into her world of talking animals and happy endings. She was my anchor, the one person who kept me from drifting away completely into the gray fog of my existence. Looking back, I can see that my love for her was fierce, almost primal. It was the love of a soldier for the one thing they are fighting to protect. She was the flag, the homeland, the reason to keep breathing. And then, the horror that had been my solitary burden threatened to become hers. When she turned 7, the monster turned his eyes to her. It was not sudden. It was a slow, creeping dread that I began to notice in small, terrifying increments. It was in the way he started to watch her, his gaze lingering a little too long when she played on the floor with her dolls. It was in the way his smile became proprietary when he lifted her onto his lap. A cold, visceral terror unlike anything I had ever known seized me by the throat. I had grown numb to my own suffering, building calluses on my soul just to get through each day. But the thought of his hands on my little sister, of that same oily, suffocating shame extinguishing her bright light, was more than I could bear. It was a prospect so horrific that it jolted me out of my passive endurance. My survival was no longer enough. I had to ensure hers. One evening, I found her crying silently in her bed, her small body curled into a tight ball, her shoulders shaking. She did not have to say a word. I knew. The look in her eyes was a shattered reflection of what I saw in my own mirror every day. The same secret was now ours. My heart broke, not in a clean snap but in a slow, grinding crunch. The last flicker of my own childhood was extinguished in that moment, replaced by a grim and heavy responsibility. I sat on her bed and wrapped my arms around her. "I know," I whispered into her hair. "I know, but you are not alone. I am here." From that night on, a silent pact was formed between us. We became co-conspirators in our own survival. We developed a language, without words, a system of quiet warnings that was invisible to everyone else. A quick, sharp glance across the dinner table if he was in a particular mood was a signal to be cautious. A subtle shake of the head when Papa suggested one of us go with him to the store late at night meant, make an excuse, say you are sick. A hand laid on a doorknob, held there just a second too long, was a silent alarm. Run.
Hide.
Go to the neighbor's house. Make yourself scarce. We became a team, moving through our home with the coordinated, intuitive grace of two small animals avoiding a predator. We would contrive to always be doing chores together in the same room. We would feign stomach aches to avoid being alone with him. It was a fragile defense, a spider's web against a storm, but it was all we had, and it bound us together with a strength born of shared terror. And then there was Sarah, my youngest sister, 7 years my junior, a whole world away from us in age and experience. Sarah was the sunshine that managed to push through the cracks of our dark, crumbling world. She was born happy, it seemed, a child with an easy laugh and a trusting heart, blessedly oblivious to the toxic undercurrent of fear that ran through our house. Betty and I orbited her like two small, fierce planets around a precious sun. Our love for her was our religion. It was our singular, unifying purpose. We played with her, we read her stories, we sang her to sleep, creating a bubble of determined innocence around her that we prayed our Father would never burst. She was our reason to endure. The thought of protecting Sarah, of preserving her light, became my North Star. It was the one clean and pure thing in a life that felt like it was sinking into mud. When I think back on those years, I see myself and Betty as two small, weary soldiers in a silent, unending war, fighting a battle no one else could see. And we were fighting for her, for the little girl who still laughed and played and slept soundly in the very house where her sisters trembled in the dark. I have often wondered since then, does the innocence of one child have the power to somehow redeem the stolen innocence of another?
I do not know the answer to that.
But in our hearts for a little while we believed it did. We had to.
It was the only hope we had to hold on to.
The walls of our house on Elm Street were not the only ones that were deaf to our suffering. The whole world, it seemed, was built of soundproof stone, designed to muffle the cries of children. My shared, Silent war with Betty was a constant, draining effort. We were two little mice in a house with a cat, and our lives were an exhausting dance of avoidance and misdirection. But I knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in my stomach, that this was not a solution.
It was a holding pattern.
Our fragile system of silent warnings and feigned illnesses was a leaky dam holding back a flood, and the pressure was building every day. The darkest fear, the one I pushed down during the daylight hours, but that rose to choke me in the night, was for Sarah. She was still wrapped in her cocoon of innocence. But I saw the way my father's eyes were starting to follow her, the same predatory interest he had once shown Betty. He would call her his little angel and lift her high in the air. And while she would squeal with delight, Betty and I would exchange a look of pure, cold terror over her head. I knew I was in a race against time. My mother was a lost cause, a ghost haunting her own life. Our secret alliance was not enough. I had to find help outside our cursed home. I had to make anyone listen. My first desperate attempt was with my 8th grade teacher, a woman named Miss Jefferson. She was young, fresh out of college, with a bright, earnest smile and a genuine passion for teaching. She often told us that her classroom was a safe space, a new term she was very fond of, and that we could come to her with any problem, no matter how big or small. In my youthful naivete, I believed her. I saw her as an emissary from a better, kinder world, a world where adults protected children. I planned my approach for days, rehearsing the words in my head until my throat was raw. One Tuesday afternoon, after the final bell had rung and the other children had exploded out into the sunshine, their shouts and laughter echoing from the schoolyard, I stayed behind. The classroom smelled of chalk dust, floor polish, and the faint, sweet scent of the apple on Miss Jefferson's desk. The quiet felt heavy, expectant. I walked up to her desk, my shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. I stood there twisting the hem of my cotton dress in my hands, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice kind. She was grading papers, a red pen poised in her hand. I could not meet her eyes. I stared at a crack in the floorboards as I spoke, the words tumbling out in a rushed, choked whisper. I could not bring myself to use the ugly, clinical words. I did not even really know them then. I just knew the feeling. "It's my father," I began. He's too affectionate with me. He touches me in ways that make my skin crawl." In private, I finally dared to look up at her, my soul laid bare in my gaze, begging her to understand, to see what I could not say. For a moment, Miss Jefferson's friendly smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then alarm. But it was quickly masked. She put her pen down and straightened a stack of papers that was already perfectly neat. Her eyes darted around the empty classroom, landing everywhere but on my face. "Eleanor," she said, her voice suddenly losing its warmth, becoming crisp and distant, the voice of a formal adult. "Your father is a very respected man in Millbrook. Everyone looks up to him." She gave a short, nervous laugh. "I'm sure he only wants what is best for you. Sometimes a father's love can be, well, it can be very demonstrative, especially with his favorite girl." She stood up and came around the desk, giving my shoulder a quick, dismissive pat. It was a gesture meant to reassure, but it felt like a door being closed in my face. "Now, you run along home," she said, her smile firmly back in place. "Don't you trouble your pretty little head with such dark thoughts." I walked out of that schoolhouse into the bright afternoon sun, but I felt cold to the bone. It was as if she had taken my reality, the one that was so terrifying and real to me, and told me it did not exist. I had not just been dismissed. I had been erased. The world I had hoped she represented, the world of safety and rules, had turned out to be just another part of the conspiracy of silence. My next attempt was in the house of God itself. Our family, like most in Millbrook, attended the First Baptist Church every Sunday. We sat in the third pew, my father looking pious and respectable, my mother looking pale and distant, my sisters and I looking like perfect, well-behaved children. I hated it. I hated the hypocrisy of singing hymns about love and redemption while living in a state of constant fear. But I thought that perhaps in the sanctity of the confessional, shielded by the anonymity of the screen, I might be safe to speak the absolute truth. The priest, Father Martin, was a stern, imposing man with a booming voice who preached with great passion about fire and brimstone and the eternal damnation of sinners. He terrified me, but I thought his rigid morality might be a weapon I could use. Surely, what my father was doing was a sin of the highest order. One Saturday, I slipped into the silent, cavernous church. The air was cool and smelled of old wood, melting wax, and the faint, sweet scent of incense. I knelt in the darkness of the confessional booth, my heart pounding in the stillness. When I heard the small shutter slide open on the other side of the screen, I began to whisper my confession. My voice was a choked, halting thing, full of shame. I confessed to the special secret my father had forced upon me. I used clearer words this time, words that felt like stones in my mouth. I spoke of his hands and his whiskey breath and the locked door. I waited for a word of comfort, of guidance, of righteous anger on my behalf. I expected him to be horrified, to tell me he would help, that he would speak to my father, that he would call the sheriff. Instead, there was a long, heavy silence that stretched for an eternity. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then, his voice came through the screen, colder and harder than a tombstone. "My child," he said, his tone devoid of any compassion. "The devil works in insidious ways. He labors to plant unclean thoughts and vexing fantasies in the minds of the young and impressionable." My blood ran cold. "You are confused," he continued. "The fifth commandment is clear. Honor thy father and thy mother. To harbor such impure and malicious thoughts against the man who puts a roof over your head and food on your table is a grave sin. You are defiling the sanctity of your own family with these fabrications." He commanded me to pray for forgiveness for my wicked imagination. He assigned me a penance of 100 Hail Marys and 50 Our Fathers and sent me away, my shame now blessed and sanctified by the church itself. I stumbled out of the confessional and into the main sanctuary, where the afternoon light streamed through the stained-glass windows, painting the pews in colors of ruby and sapphire. I felt as though I had not only been violated by my father, but I was now a sinner in the eyes of God for daring to name my violator. My suffering had not been heard. It had been judged as a moral failing of my own. My last hope, my final, desperate appeal, was to my maternal grandmother, Hazel. She lived on a small, hardscrabble farm a few miles out of town. Grandma Hazel was the opposite of my mother in every way. She was a tough, weathered woman with hands as gnarled as oak roots, a woman who smelled of chicken feed and rich soil. She had seen the hard side of life and had not been broken by it. I thought that she, a woman of the earth, a woman who was not beholden to the town's social niceties, might finally be the one to understand. One Saturday, my mother sent me to her house with a basket of preserves. I found her on the back porch, snapping peas into a large metal bowl. The rhythmic snapping a steady, comforting sound. I sat with her and helped, my small hands moving alongside her large, capable ones. For a long time, we worked in silence. Then, I took a deep breath and I told her everything. The words tumbled out in a messy, tearful rush, about my father, about Betty, about my fear for Sarah. I told her about Miss Jefferson and Father Martin. I laid the entire, ugly story at her feet. She listened without expression, her gnarled fingers never ceasing their rhythmic work. Snap.
Ping.
Snap.
Ping.
When I finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, she sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to come from the very depths of her bones. "Ellie girl," she said, her voice not unkind, but as blunt and unsentimental as the hard-packed earth of her yard. "This world ain't a fair place. It never has been, especially not for a woman." She finally stopped her work and looked me straight in the eye, her gaze clear and unwavering. "Men are what they are. And your father, Walter, he has a demon in him, always has. But he's a provider. He keeps a roof over your heads. Her words were a death sentence to my hope. "You can't change him, child," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. "And you sure as hell can't fight him. You'll lose. He'll break you." She reached over and took one of my hands. "So, you got to learn something else. You got to learn to be clever. You learn to be somewhere else when he gets that look in his eye. You learn to duck. That's how you survive." She was not telling me to find help. She was telling me there was no help to be found. She was acknowledging the monster was real, and then telling me to simply learn to live with it. I rode home in a daze, the bowl of fresh peas sitting on my lap. Each rejection from my mother, my teacher, my pastor, and now my grandmother was another nail hammered into the coffin of my hope. They had all, in their own ways, conspired to protect him, to maintain the status quo. They had built a fortress of denial, fear, and social convention around him, and left me, Betty, and Sarah trapped inside with the monster. It was the most profound and devastating lesson of my young life. I was utterly, completely on my own. No one was coming to save us. The world was not going to save us. As I walked up the steps to my own front door, that cursed house on Elm Street, I felt something shift deep inside me. The fear was still there, but it was now joined by something else. Something cold and hard and sharp. It was the first flicker of rage. And with it came a terrifying, crystal-clear thought. If the world will not deal with your monster, then you have to deal with him yourself. The ride home from my grandmother's farm was a journey through a dead and empty landscape. The world that had once held at least the possibility of rescue was now a barren desert. Every door I had knocked on had been slammed shut in my face, and the echoes of those slammed doors resonated in the hollow space where my hope used to be. The rage that had flickered to life inside me was a strange and terrifying thing. It was a cold fire, not a hot one. It did not make me want to scream. It made me want to think. It settled deep in my bones, a new kind of spine made of ice and steel. I understood, with the finality of a death sentence, that the cavalry was not coming. In the story of our lives, there were no heroes. There was only the monster, and there were his victims. And I was no longer willing to be a victim. The turning point, the moment the cold rage began to sharpen into a weapon, came on the sweltering evening of my 16th birthday, July 19th, 1957. It was not a celebration. In our house, milestones were just markers of time spent in captivity. That evening, my father had been drinking more heavily than usual, celebrating some business deal he had closed. And sooner or later, it always found you. Later that night, long after my mother had drifted off in her laudanum haze and my sisters were asleep, I decided to make a desperate, foolish attempt to run. It was not a plan born of logic, but of pure, suffocating desperation. For months, I had been squirreling away the occasional coin he would give me for a soda pop, hiding them in a loose floorboard under my bed. It amounted to less than $5. I packed a small canvas bag with a change of clothes, a worn copy of Jane Eyre, and my pathetic handful of savings. I thought if I could just get to the bus station downtown, I could buy a ticket to anywhere. Birmingham, Montgomery, anywhere that was not Millbrook. Anywhere he was not. I waited until I heard the deep, rhythmic sound of his snoring from the master bedroom. The house was finally still. I slipped out of my room, my bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. I carried my shoes in one hand and the bag in the other. Every creak of the old house was magnified in the silence, sounding as loud as a gunshot to my terrified ears. I navigated the familiar landscape of the downstairs hallway in the dark, my hand outstretched, brushing against the wall. The front door was my goal. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and my father's lingering cigar smoke. I reached the door, my fingers trembling as they closed around the cool brass of the doorknob.
Freedom was just on the other side.
I turned the knob with infinite slowness, holding my breath, as if he had been waiting for me all along.
He was not yelling.
He was not even angry. The calm on his face was 1,000 times more terrifying than any rage. "And just where do you think you're going, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice low and deceptively soft. I had no answer. The bag fell from my numb fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, plunging the hallway back into darkness. He took me by the arm, his grip like a vice, and led me into the living room. He did not turn on a light. He pushed me down into a chair. "I provide a roof over your head," he said, his voice a low growl. "I put food on your table and clothes on your back. And this is how you repay me? With defiance? With disrespect?" He began to unbuckle his belt. The sound of the leather sliding through the metal buckle was sickeningly familiar. "I see I have been too lenient with you," he said. Each strike of the heavy leather belt was a word in a sermon of pain, a lesson about his absolute power and my absolute helplessness. I did not cry out. I bit my lip until I tasted the salt of my own blood, refusing to give him the satisfaction of my screams. I retreated to that fortified place in my mind, leaving my body behind to absorb the blows. There was no leaving. The cage was absolute, and he was the keeper. It was a few weeks later, as the deep, ugly bruises on my back and legs were fading from a sickly purple to a mottled yellow-green. But beneath, my despair had deepened into a state of cold, bottomless emptiness. I had given up. It was late, well past midnight. The house was wrapped in the deep, profound silence of a moonless, humid night. I could not sleep. I rarely slept soundly anymore. I would lie awake for hours, my mind racing, or I would sit by my window and just stare out into the darkness, feeling like a ghost. From my bedroom door, which I always left slightly ajar, I had a clear view down the long, dark hallway. And then I saw it, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows near my parents' room. My breath caught in my chest. It was my father. He was moving with a quiet, predatory grace that sent a wave of ice water through my veins. He was not moving toward the bathroom. He was not moving toward my room. He was moving, step by silent step, toward the small bedroom at the very end of the hall. Sarah's room. Sarah was 7 years old. She was the same age Betty had been when it started. She was the same age I imagined so many other little girls had been in other houses in other towns. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity of horror. My blood turned to sludge in my veins. My ears were ringing. I saw his large, dark hand reach for her doorknob. I watched, frozen, as he turned it with an infinite, terrible slowness. I heard the faint click of the latch. In that single, horrifying instant, as he pushed her door open and slipped into the darkness of her room, something inside me did not just break. It shattered into a million pieces, and then was instantly forged back together by the sheer, incandescent force of my will into something new. Something hard. I was no longer a victim cowering in the dark. I was a sister. I was a protector. I was the only thing on this earth standing between that monster and the last innocent soul in this house. And I realized, with a certainty that was as calm as it was terrifying, that as long as Walter Johnson was alive, none of us would ever be safe. His presence was a cancer, a rot that had infected every part of our lives, and it was spreading to the one pure thing we had left. You do not reason with a cancer. You do not try to escape a cancer. You cut it out.
Completely.
That night, lying in my bed, listening to the frantic, panicked beating of my own heart, I made a decision. It was no longer a question of if I could escape him. It was no longer a question of who would save me. The only question left was how to stop him. My father had to die, and I, his broken, beaten, favorite girl, would be the one to make it happen. It settled into my soul like a stone at the bottom of a deep, still, and incredibly cold lake. The night I saw him slip into Sarah's room, the storm inside me broke. And, in its aftermath, there was a terrible, preternatural calm. The fear, the panic, the constant, frantic scurrying for safety, it all burned away, leaving behind only a singular, unadulterated purpose. There was no more moral debate, no more girlish hope for rescue. The world had shown me its rules, and I had learned them well. The strong devour the weak, and silence is the predator's greatest ally. I could no longer afford to be weak or silent. My new reality was simple. It was him or us. And I had made my choice. But how does a 16-year-old girl, with no money, no power? For a couple of years, I had been helping out at the general store after school and on Saturdays. My father did not have me do this out of any desire to teach me the family business. He did it because it was free labor. But in one of his rare moments of what he probably considered paternal foresight, he decided I needed to be useful with the books. He grumbled that a woman needed to know enough about numbers to not get cheated by her husband. He arranged for me to learn basic accounting from an old, kind man in town named Mr. Tibbets. Wispy man with ink stains on the cuffs of his white shirts and silver-rimmed spectacles that were always perched on the very end of his nose. His tiny office, debits on the left, credits on the right. Assets must equal liabilities plus equity. For every transaction, there was an equal and opposite transaction. It was clean. It was fair. It was a universe where everything had to balance, down to the very last penny. Mr. Tibbs praised my quickness with numbers and my neat, precise handwriting in the ledgers. "You have a gift for this, Eleanor," he would say, peering over his spectacles at my work. "A mind for detail." He had no idea what kind of details I would soon be minding. I loved the feel of the heavy paper, the satisfying scratch of the pen, the way a long column of figures would add up to a clean, irrefutable truth. In my father's house, truth was a slippery, dangerous thing. In Mr. Tibbs's office, it was the bedrock of everything. It was in my pursuit of this clean truth that I stumbled upon my father's dirty secrets. He thought I was just a mindless drone, copying figures from his notes into the official store ledger. He did not realize that Mr. Tibbs was not just teaching me how to write the numbers down. I found the key. He had carelessly left it on his desk ring. My hands trembling, I unlocked the drawer. The black notebook was there. I did not have much time. I took it, hid it under my sweater, and left the key where I found it. That night, in my room, with the door wedged shut with a chair, I read the real story. He was systematically skimming from the store's profits, pocketing cash sales, and creating false expenses to lower his tax burden. It was petty, greedy, and stupid. But his biggest and most dangerous deception was with a man named Johnny Marks. Johnny Marks was not from Millbrook. He was rumored to have connections to illegal gambling rings and other unsavory operations that were the stuff of hushed gossip. A few years back, my father had borrowed a significant sum of money from him to expand the store and add a new section for hardware. It was a high-interest, off-the-books loan. And I discovered, playing a man like Johnny Marks for a fool. My father, in his arrogance, believed he was smarter than everyone. And there, in the pages of that sordid little black book, I saw it. The path. The weapon. It was a plan that began to form in the cold, quiet hours of that night, a chillingly intricate web woven from my knowledge of double-entry bookkeeping and my father's own boundless greed. It was a perfect plan, really. A plan that would allow me to kill him without ever laying a hand on him, without a single drop of blood on my hands. My role would be that of a ghost, an unseen hand guiding the pieces on the board into their final, fatal positions. I would use his own sin, his own corruption, as the weapon that would bring about his end. It was a kind of justice that appealed to my new cold heart. Poetic justice. The kind you read about in books. Over the next several weeks, I executed my plan with a patience and a precision that, looking back, frightens me still. I became two people. On the surface, I was the quiet, dutiful, slightly sullen teenage daughter. But underneath, I was a meticulous strategist, an avenging angel with a fountain pen. When my father was out, usually at the Rotary Club or a poker game, I would find excuses to go to the store. I would tell my mother I needed a book for school or had to finish some inventory records. She never questioned it, lost in her own fog. Once there, I would lock the door and get to work. I did not just have to expose his fraud. I decided that was not enough. I had to amplify it. I had to turn his petty theft into a grand, undeniable betrayal that would trigger the rage of a man like Marks. I began to make my own subtle, deliberate errors in the ledger that he showed to Johnny Marks's men. I carefully fabricated entries that, if ever scrutinized, would create an undeniable trail not just of struggle, but of deliberate, calculated deception. I created fake invoices for non-existent. I carefully altered the dates on certain large cash transactions to make it look like my father was hiding income. Individually, they were small, almost unnoticeable discrepancies. But taken together, they painted a masterpiece of fraud. I was not just creating errors. I was authoring a detailed narrative of betrayal, written in the clear, irrefutable language of numbers. It was the most important story I would ever write, and its ending would be my father's death. The ledger was my canvas, and on it, I had painted a masterpiece of deceit. But a painting is useless until it is seen by the right eyes. My meticulously crafted narrative of fraud needed a delivery system. It needed a messenger. The final step of my plan was the most dangerous, the one that would move the story from the theoretical realm of numbers into the brutal reality of men and violence. I had to write the letter. I could not risk using the typewriter at our home, nor the one at the store. My father was careless, but not a complete fool. The distinctive typeface of a specific machine could be a thread that could unravel everything. My thoughts turned again to Mr. Tibbs. His dusty little office above the barber shop was my sanctuary of logic, and now it would become the laboratory for my revenge. He had an old, heavy, black Remington typewriter that he rarely used, preferring his fountain pens for most work. It was perfect. One Thursday afternoon, I knew Mr. Tibbs had his weekly checker game at the town hall. I told my mother I needed to return a bookkeeping manual to his office. She barely looked up from the mending in her lap. I let myself into his quiet office. The key he kept under the mat feeling heavy and significant in my hand. The room was still and smelled of his pipe tobacco and old paper. It felt like a desecration, using this kind, gentle man's space for such a dark purpose. But I pushed the feeling down. Kindness was a luxury I could no longer afford. From my school bag, I took out a pair of my mother's thin cotton gardening gloves. I put them on, the fabric feeling strange and clumsy on my fingers. I rolled a single sheet of plain paper into the Remington's platen. The metallic clack of the keys sounded like gunshots in the silent room. I typed slowly, deliberately, pressing each key with a firm, even pressure. I made a few intentional errors and backspace to correct them, wanting it to look authentic, the work of a nervous but determined person. The letter was short and to the point, crafted to inflict the maximum damage to my father's standing and the maximum insult to Johnny Marks's pride. It read, "To Mr. Marks, I am an employee at Johnson's General Store. I cannot say my name. I am writing this because my conscience demands it. You put your trust in Mr. Walter Johnson, and he is repaying you with betrayal. He is laughing behind your back. He boasts to others about how he is pulling the wool over the city man's eyes. He is skimming thousands of dollars from the profits he is supposed to be sharing with you. He is not a struggling businessman. He is a liar and a thief. If you do not believe me, do not take my word for it. Demand to see the real books. Look closely at the inventory invoices from the last 6 months, especially the ones for hardware and machine parts. You will find the proof of his deception. He is stealing from you every single day. A concerned party. I read it over. It was perfect. It was not just an accusation of theft. It was an accusation of disrespect. It painted my father as arrogant and mocking. For a man like Johnny Marks, being made a fool of was a far greater sin than simply being cheated. I pulled the paper from the typewriter, folded it carefully, while still wearing the gloves, and slipped it into a plain white envelope. The final, crucial step was mailing it. It could not be mailed from Millbrook. The postmistress, Mrs. Gable, was the biggest gossip in the county. An envelope addressed to a known loan shark's post office box in the city, sent from her post office, would be the talk of the town by supper time. The next day, Friday, I faked a headache and stayed home from school. In the mid-morning, when my father was at the store and my mother was taking her rest, I took 25 cents from the kitchen jar and walked to the bus station. I bought a round-trip ticket to Clanton, the county seat, 20 miles away. The bus ride was surreal. I sat staring out the window at the familiar Alabama pines and red clay banks, the anonymous letter feeling like a burning coal in my pocketbook. In Clanton, I walked several blocks from the bus station to the main post office. It was a large, imposing brick building, a place of federal anonymity. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. I walked up the stone steps, my gloved hand clutching the envelope. This was it. This was the point of no return. I pushed the letter through the cold, brass slot of the outgoing mail drop. I did not hear it land. The slot snapped shut with a metallic finality. The stone was thrown. Now, all I could do was wait for the ripples to reach the shore. The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of my life. I lived in a state of suspended animation, of unbearable, screaming tension that was hidden beneath a calm, placid exterior. Every day was a performance. I did my chores. I went to school. I helped Betty with her homework. I played dolls with Sarah. On the surface, I was the same Eleanor. But inside, I was a coiled spring. Every car that slowed down on our street sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Every time the phone rang, my breath would catch in my throat. I watched my father with a new, chilling sense of detachment. He was a dead man walking, and only I knew it. I would sit across the dinner table from him, watching him eat, listening to him complain about a customer or boast about a sale, and I would feel nothing. The rage was gone. The fear was gone. There was only the cold, patient certainty of an outcome I had set in motion. He was an equation I had already solved. The first Tuesday of the month came and went. Johnny Marks's collectors did not show up. This was the first sign. It meant they had received the letter and were not coming for their usual, doctored payment. They were investigating. A week later, on the next Tuesday, it happened. It was a sweltering afternoon in late July, the kind of day where the heat radiated up from the pavement in shimmering waves. The air was thick and still. I was in the backyard with Sarah, pushing her on the tire swing that hung from the big oak tree. Betty was at a friend's house. My father was at the store, as he always was on a weekday afternoon. We heard the siren first. A long, mournful, rising and falling wail that cut through the thick, humid air. In a small town like Millbrook, a siren is an event. It is a signal that the town's placid surface has been broken. People came out onto their front porches, shielding their eyes against the sun, looking down the street. I felt a cold dread wash over me, but it was mixed with a surge of something else, a terrible, electric anticipation. I stopped pushing the swing and held Sarah's hand, my own palms suddenly slick with sweat. Then we saw it, the black and white Ford police car. Its single red light flashing silently now, rolled slowly down Elm Street. It did not pass by. It stopped directly in front of our house. Sheriff Brody got out of the car. I had known him my whole life. He was a large, slow-moving man whose belly strained the buttons of his uniform. My father often let him have groceries on credit that he never seemed to pay back. He took off his hat and wiped his brow with the back of his hand as he walked up our front path. His face was grim, his eyes avoiding the house. My mother, drawn by the commotion, came to the screen door, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mask of dazed confusion. Sarah started to cry, frightened by the tension in the air. "Mary," Sheriff Brody said, his voice low and heavy.
He would not look her in the eye.
He looked at the porch floor. "There's been an incident down at the store." My mother just stared at him. "An incident," she repeated, her voice thin. "It seems," he said, clearing his throat, "there was a robbery. A robbery gone wrong." He finally looked up, and his eyes were full of a miserable, reluctant pity. "Mary, I'm so sorry. Walter is dead." The world seemed to go silent for a moment. My mother's face, which had been confused, crumpled. She did not scream. She made a small, wounded sound, like an animal, and then she simply folded, her body collapsing in on itself in a slow-motion fall against the doorframe. Sarah's crying turned into frightened wails, and I stood there, A 16-year-old girl holding my little sister's hand, the tire swing still swaying gently behind me, and I felt a single, overwhelming emotion wash over me. It was not grief. It was not joy. It was not even guilt, not yet. It was relief. A vast, breathtaking, terrifying relief. It felt as if a mountain that had been crushing my chest for years had suddenly been lifted, and I could finally take a full, deep breath. The monster was gone. The cage was open. I had done it. My elaborate plan, born of numbers and pain, had worked. The official story would be a robbery. The whispers in town would be about a man who got in over his head with dangerous people. No one would ever look at his quiet, grieving, 16-year-old daughter. The freedom was dizzying. But as I looked at my mother's vacant, weeping face and my sister's terrified sobs, a new, cold dread began to creep in around the edges of my relief. I had killed my father to save my family. But I had a sickening feeling that the price of that freedom was a debt I would be paying, in silence and in secret, for the rest of my life. The aftermath of my father's death was a strange and surreal purgatory. The town of Millbrook, in its predictable way, wrapped our family in a thick, suffocating blanket of casseroles and condolences. Our house filled with the cloying scent of lilies and baked ham. Neighbors and church members came in a steady stream, their faces etched with practiced sympathy. They spoke of my father in hushed, reverent tones, recalling his generosity at the store, his firm handshake, his booming laugh at the annual town picnic. They called him a good man, a family man, a pillar of the community taken too soon by a senseless act of violence. I sat on the hard sofa in our living room, dressed in a borrowed black dress, and played my part. I was the grieving daughter. I nodded, I whispered, "Thank you." I accepted their hugs, and I allowed them to pat my hand and tell me to be strong for my mother and sisters.
Inside,
I was a hollow chamber where their empty platitudes echoed and died. With each kind word they spoke about him, a cold, hard knot of contempt tightened in my stomach. They were mourning a fiction, a carefully constructed mask he had worn for them. They had no idea about the monster who lived behind the mask, the monster I had slain. Father Martin, the same man who had called my truths a wicked fantasy, conducted the funeral service. He stood at the pulpit and eulogized Walter Johnson as a God-fearing man, a loving husband and father. I stared at him from the front pew, my face a perfect mask of sorrow, and I felt a profound and terrible sense of alienation.
I was not one of them.
I was an imposter in their world of simple truths and convenient lies. My secret set me apart, an invisible wall between me and everyone I had ever known. Looking at Betty beside me, her face pale and her eyes red from real, confused tears, I felt a pang of guilt. She was mourning the father she had been forced to love and fear. Sarah, too young to understand death, was simply bewildered by the adult sadness that had enveloped our home. I, on the other hand, was mourning nothing. I was simply enduring the performance until the curtain fell. The curtain fell soon enough. The casseroles stopped coming, and the hushed whispers of sympathy were replaced by the harsh realities of our new life. As I had anticipated, Johnny Marks's debt was the first thing to be settled. Two men I had never seen before, men in city suits that looked out of place in our small town, came to the house a week after the funeral. They were not violent or threatening. They were worse. They were quiet, polite, and utterly implacable. They sat with my mother, who was in her usual laudanum fog, and presented her with a sheaf of papers my father had signed. With them was a lawyer, who explained the cold, hard facts. The store, the inventory, the building itself. Nearly everything my father had owned was collateral for his debt. They were liquidating his assets to cover what he owed, plus a considerable amount for the trouble he had caused. The town saw it as the final, heartbreaking tragedy for the poor, widowed Johnson family. I saw it for what it was, the closing of a transaction. A debt paid in full. We were left with almost nothing. The house was rented, and we had 3 months before we would have to leave. We were destitute. The future stretched before us as a bleak, terrifying void. And then, A small miracle arrived in the form of Mr. Tibbs. The kind old bookkeeper, bless his heart, felt a sense of duty to my father's memory, or perhaps a sense of pity for us girls. He came by the house one evening, his hat in his hands, and offered to help me and my mother sort through the financial wreckage. It was he who suggested we check the safe deposit box my father kept at the bank in Clanton. And there, tucked away in a dusty metal box behind a stack of property deeds that were now worthless, he found it, a life insurance policy. My father, the man who was so reckless with our safety and his own life, had been meticulous about this one thing. Perhaps it was for his image, the need to be seen as a responsible provider even after his death. The policy was substantial. Taken out years ago, its value had grown. It was not a fortune that would make us rich, but it was enough.
It was a chance. It was a lifeline. It was a way out.
But a way out to where? And with whom? My mother was unraveling completely. Without my father's domineering presence to anchor her, to provide the focus for her fear and dependence, she had drifted off into a sea of grief and medication from which she could not, or would not, return. She was incapable of making decisions, incapable of caring for herself, let alone for 3 daughters. She would spend her days staring blankly at the wall, or weeping softly for reasons she could not articulate. The thought of being left in her care, or worse, of the state splitting us girls up and sending us to live with distant, uncaring relatives, was a new kind of terror. I had not come this far, I had not done what I had done, only to lose my sisters now. I had freed them from one cage. I would not stand by and watch them be locked in another. With a boldness that, looking back, still surprises me, I took matters into my own hands. I put on my best dress, took the bus to Clanton, and went to see the lawyer Mr. Tibbs had recommended, a man named Mr. Abernathy. I was 16 years old, but as I sat across the wide, polished desk from him, I spoke with the authority of a woman twice my age. I did not cry. I did not show emotion. I laid out the situation with the cold, clear logic I had learned from Mr. Tibbs's ledgers. I described my mother's illness, her inability to function. I explained the insurance money, and I stated my absolute, unshakable determination to keep my family together. I told him I wanted to petition the court for temporary guardianship of Betty and Sarah. Mr. Abernathy looked at me over his spectacles, his expression unreadable. It was an audacious, almost unheard-of request. But I was articulate. I was prepared. I had brought my school report cards to prove I was responsible. I had a budget written out, showing how we could live on the insurance money. And I had a secret weapon, my own certainty, with the quiet, steadfast support of Mr. Tibbs, who agreed to come to the hearing and testify to my maturity and capability. The impossible happened. We went before a judge in a quiet, wood-paneled courtroom. The judge looked at me, a solemn 16-year-old girl. He looked at my mother, who sat weeping quietly beside me, unable to answer his simplest questions. He listened to Mr. Tibbs's heartfelt testimony, and then he granted my request. I was 16 years old, and I was now the legal guardian of my 2 younger sisters. The weight of that responsibility was immense, but it was also a shield. It was power. It was control over our own destiny. The decision to leave Millbrook was the easiest one I ever made. The town was not a home. It was a graveyard. It was a monument to our suffering, filled with ghosts and lies. Every street corner, every familiar face, was a reminder of what had happened there. We needed to escape the shadow of Walter Johnson for good. We needed a place where we were not the poor Johnson girls. In August of 1958, less than 2 months after my father's death, the 3 of us, me, 12-year-old Betty, and 7-year-old Sarah, boarded a Greyhound bus with 3 worn suitcases and a one-way ticket to Atlanta, Georgia. As the bus pulled away from the small, dusty station, I looked back at the receding skyline of the town that had been my entire world. I felt no nostalgia, no sadness for what I was leaving behind. I felt only the exhilarating, terrifying thrill of a prisoner tasting freedom for the very first time. We were leaving the wreckage behind. We were driving toward a new dawn, and for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to believe that the sun might actually rise for us. The stone of my secret was still cold in my gut, but for the first time, it was joined by a fragile, fluttering new feeling: hope. Atlanta was a world away from Millbrook. It was a sprawling, chaotic, magnificent city, a place of constant noise and blessed anonymity. To three girls from a small Alabama town, it was both overwhelming and profoundly liberating. In Millbrook, we were defined by our story. In Atlanta, we had no story. We were nobody. We were invisible. And for me, invisibility was the greatest gift, the most profound luxury I could have asked for. It was a shield. It was a blank page. It was a chance to build a new identity from scratch. One that was not defined by my father's crimes or by my own. We found a small, clean apartment in a modest neighborhood with tree-lined streets. The insurance money was not endless, but I budgeted it with the fierce precision of a general planning a campaign. It was enough to keep us afloat while I figured out our next steps. My first priority was my sisters. I enrolled Betty in the local junior high and Sarah in elementary school. I created a routine, a structure for our lives that was built on predictability and love, the two things we had never consistently known. I cooked our meals. I helped with homework. I braided Sarah's hair and listened to Betty's stories about her new friends and the teacher she liked. I tried my best to be a mother and a father to them, all while being not much more than a child myself. When I think back on it now, I honestly wonder where I found the strength. But I suppose you never know how strong you are until being strong is the only choice you have. I had to be their rock because they were my reason for everything. My own education had been shattered, but I was determined to piece it back together. I found a night school program that offered classes for adults trying to earn their high school diplomas. 3 evenings a week. After my sisters were fed and their homework was done, I would take a city bus across town to a brightly lit but tired-looking school building. I sat in a classroom filled with other people whose lives had taken a detour, young mothers, immigrants, men who had left school to work. It was in that dimly lit classroom, which smelled of chalk dust and strong, stale coffee, that I met Thomas Schmidt. He was a volunteer, a young math teacher from the high school who gave his time freely to help people like us. He was quiet and serious, but he had the kindest eyes I had ever seen. He had a way of explaining algebra that made it seem simple and logical, and he never once made me feel foolish for what I did not know. He treated me with a gentle respect that was entirely foreign to me. I was cautious at first, walled off by years of profound distrust. Men, in my experience, were a source of danger and pain. But Thomas was different. He was persistent in the gentlest of ways. He would stay after class to help me with a difficult problem, and our conversations would slowly, carefully drift from numbers to books, to music, to our quiet dreams for the future. He never pushed, never pried, never asked about my family or my past. He simply created a space of quiet, unconditional acceptance. He saw me, not the surrogate mother, not the traumatized survivor, but just Ellie, the girl who was good at math. One cool autumn evening, sitting in an old coffee shop after class, nursing 2 cups of coffee, I did something I had sworn to myself I would never do. I told him part of my story. I did not tell him about the plan, about the letter, about the cold, satisfying relief I had felt at my father's death. But I told him about the fear. I told him about the abuse. I told him why the 3 of us had come to Atlanta with nothing but 3 suitcases. I spoke in a low, halting voice, my eyes fixed on my hands wrapped around my coffee cup, fully expecting to see judgment or pity or even disgust in his eyes when I finally looked up. Instead, when I finished, he just listened to the silence for a moment. Then he reached across the small table and gently covered my hands with his. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was just warm, solid, grounding. "Ellie," he said, his voice soft and full of a sincerity that broke through my defenses. "I am so sorry that happened to you. No one should ever have to go through that." And that was it. No prying questions.
No horrified gasp. No judgment.
Just simple, profound acceptance. In that moment, the first hairline crack appeared in the thick, icy wall I had built around my heart. He did not try to fix me. He just sat with me in my brokenness, and in doing so, he gave me the first piece of myself back. We were married on a sunny afternoon on my 23rd birthday in a small, simple ceremony at the courthouse. Betty and Sarah, by then a beautiful teenager and a bright young girl, were my bridesmaids. As I stood there beside this good, gentle man, this man who had shown me that kindness was real, I felt a kind of peace I had never, ever believed was possible. The past was not gone, and I knew it never would be. But, for the very first time, it felt like it did not have to be the only story that defined my future. A new dawn, it turned out, was not just something you hoped for. It was something you built, piece by painful, hopeful piece. The years that followed our wedding were a testament to the quiet, healing power of ordinary love and purposeful work. My life with Thomas was a calm harbor after a lifetime at sea in a storm. He was my anchor, my confidant, and my greatest champion. With his unwavering encouragement, I not only earned my high school diploma, but I went on to college, attending night classes for years, slowly but steadily working my way toward a degree. I eventually became what I had once dreamed of being, a teacher. It felt like a sacred calling. My own classroom, filled with the scent of chalk and young minds, was the sanctuary I had craved as a child. It was in that classroom, however, that I began to see the ghosts of my own past. I saw them in the eyes of a child who flinched when I raised my voice to get the class's attention. I saw them in the unexplained, faded yellow bruises on a little girl's arm, which she tried to hide under her long sleeves even on the hottest days. I saw them in the quiet desperation of a student who was always hungry, who would hoard scraps from lunch because he never knew if there would be dinner at home. I knew that my story, in its many different and terrible forms, was still being lived out behind the closed doors of countless homes, right here in this big city, just as it had been in my small town. This knowledge became a persistent, aching whisper in my soul. I had built a new life. I had found safety and love. But how could I live in peace, knowing that other children were still trapped in the same darkness I had known? When I would look at my students, happily learning their multiplication tables, I would wonder, do we as adults truly see the children in front of us? Or do we see only what is convenient, what does not trouble our conscience? I could not stay silent. I could not turn away, as so many had turned away from me. My secret, the terrible act that had bought my freedom, demanded that my life be one of service. It was a debt I felt I owed. In 1975, Thomas and I made a decision that would change our lives forever. We took our entire life savings, every penny we had carefully put away, and we founded the New Dawn Center. It started so small, so humbly, in the damp, musty basement of a local church that agreed to rent us the space for a pittance. At first, it was just an after-school tutoring program, a safe, warm place for kids to go for a few hours. We offered milk and cookies, help with homework, and a listening ear. But we quickly realized the need was so much greater than we had ever imagined. The tutoring was just a doorway. Through it came stories of neglect, of violence, of the same soul-crushing secrets I had once carried. We started a support group for mothers, then a crisis hotline that Thomas and I manned ourselves, the phone ringing at all hours of the night. A few years later, after tireless fundraising and securing a small loan from the bank, we managed to buy a large, old, dilapidated house on a quiet street. It took us a year of working every weekend, with the help of volunteers, to fix it up. And then, the New Dawn Center became what I had always dreamed it could be, a full-time residential shelter for girls and young women escaping abuse. It was a place where they could find not just a bed and a hot meal, but intensive therapy, educational support, job training, legal aid, and most importantly, a community of people who understood and believed them without question. It was the sanctuary I never had. Over the next 4 decades, the center grew beyond anything I could have hoped for. We helped more than 1,500 girls and young women find their way out of the darkness. I saw girls who arrived at our doorstep broken, silent, and filled with a shame that was not theirs to carry, blossom into strong, independent women, doctors, lawyers, artists, mechanics, and mothers who were determined to break the cycle of violence. Each one of them was a quiet victory against the darkness. Each one of them was a piece of my own healing. I never told any of them my full story, the secret of my father's death. But I shared my pain. I shared my experience of abuse, and in doing so, I showed them that they were not alone. My scars, I came to realize, were not a source of shame. They were a testament to my survival, and they gave me the language, the authority, to speak to theirs. When I turned 50 years old, I felt a strange and powerful pull to go back. I needed to see Millbrook one last time, not as the frightened, fleeing girl I had been, but as the woman I had become. I drove down alone. A journey of 5 hours that felt like a journey of 30 years. The town had changed in some ways, a new traffic light, a few different storefronts, but in its bones, it was eerily the same. The general store had a new name, Millbrook Mercantile, but the building was still there, a silent monument to my past. I walked through the quiet streets and found myself talking to a few of the old-timers who were still around, people who were now stooped and gray themselves. And I learned something that both shocked me and confirmed what my gut had always told me. People had known. They had not known the ugly specifics, not the true depth of the horror. But they had suspected. They spoke of my father's terrible temper, of the troubles in our house. An elderly woman who had been our next-door neighbor confessed, with tears in her eyes, that she used to hear terrible sounds from our house at night, but was too afraid of my father to ever call the sheriff. They had all seen the fear in our eyes, my mother's vacant stare. The way Betty and I were like two little shadows. They had suspected, and they had done nothing. They had chosen the comfort of their own denial, the ease of minding their own business, over the safety of 3 little girls. And I learned something else, something that settled another piece of the puzzle into place. An old woman, one who had worked for my father as a teenager, confided in me in a hushed, embarrassed voice that my father had bothered her, too. That he had cornered her in the stockroom, that he had a reputation for preying on young, vulnerable women in the town. His depravity had not been confined to his own home. He was a serial predator who had used his power and his position as a pillar of the community to prey on the weak. The knowledge did not erase the cold stone of my guilt, but it solidified the terrible rightness of my decision all those years ago. I had not just saved my sisters. I had slain a dragon who would have gone on burning and devouring for years to come. The most difficult and most necessary part of my healing came from the conversations I finally had with Betty and Sarah. For years, the 3 of us had operated under an unspoken agreement not to talk about the past. It was a locked room in the house of our relationship. But now, as middle-aged women with lives of our own, we finally found the courage to turn the key. Betty, who had become a Catholic nun, dedicating her life to running an orphanage for abandoned children in South America, came to visit. We sat up late one night, and I told her everything. When I was done, she was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at me, her eyes filled with a deep, sad wisdom. "I always knew, Ellie," she said softly. "On some level, I always knew it wasn't a robbery. I never asked because I didn't want you to have to say it. But I knew. And I have thanked God for what you did every day of my life." Sarah, who had been shielded from the worst of it and was now a loving, joyful kindergarten teacher, had a harder time. Learning the full truth was devastating for her, shattering the idealized image of the father she barely remembered. But it also, finally, helped her understand the shadows that had always lingered at the edges of our family. We cried together. We held each other, and in that shared honesty, the final layers of the wound that had bound us together in silence began to heal in the light.
So here I am,
an old woman in a comfortable chair, telling a story that has been silent for a lifetime. I lived a full life. I loved a good, kind man for 50 wonderful years until he passed away peacefully in his sleep. I raised and was raised by two sisters who became remarkable women of strength and compassion. I built a legacy of hope from the ashes of my own despair. Was what I did a sin? By the laws of men and God, I am sure it was. The stone of that secret will always be a part of me. But I have come to believe, as the good book says, that the Lord works in mysterious ways. Perhaps sometimes, to save the flock, the shepherd must confront the wolf in the most final of ways. My message to you, the reason I am finally breaking my long silence, is this. The darkest scars can heal. There is hope. Even in the deepest pit of despair, you can survive. You can reclaim your life. You can break the cycle. If you are a victim, living in that silent terror right now, please, I beg of you, find the courage to tell someone. Keep telling people until someone finally listens. And if you are a bystander, if you suspect, if you see the fear in a child's eyes or hear the cries through a neighbor's wall, do not turn away. Do not choose comfort over courage. Your voice, your action, could be the one thing that saves a life. My life is my testament. It is the proof that a new dawn can and will break, even after the longest, darkest, and most terrible night.